The air inside the Sistine Chapel felt like it was holding its breath. Every stone, every painted corner, every shadow on the frescoed ceiling seemed to carry the weight of what was unfolding. This was no ordinary day in Vatican City. This was a day that would echo in the history books, a moment where the course of the Catholic Church and perhaps the world would take a new direction. Inside the sacred walls, the College of Cardinals had gathered, dressed in their red robes, heads bowed in solemn prayer and reflection. Their mission was not just important, it was sacred. They were tasked with choosing a new shepherd for over 1 billion Catholics across the globe. From every part of the world, cardinals had traveled to be part of this monumental decision. Some came from nations filled with conflict, others from peaceful towns. They brought with them not only their knowledge and faith, but also the hopes and prayers of millions. It was not a responsibility to be taken lightly. The Church was standing at a crossroads, facing a modern world full of challenges, technological, social, political, and spiritual. The next pope would have to be someone who could connect tradition with progress, who could speak to both the hearts of the devout and the questions of the skeptics. Days passed. The cardinals prayed, discussed, debated, and voted. The faithful waited in St. Peter's Square, eyes constantly watching the chimney of the Sistine Chapel. The black smoke rose again and again, a sign that no decision had been made. Yet hope never left the crowd. Pilgrims, tourists, priests, and nuns waited in quiet unity. There was something comforting about their presence. It reminded the world that faith at its core is about waiting, believing, and trusting. And then it happened. The moment they had prayed for finally arrived. As the sun rose over Vatican City, casting a golden hue across the majestic square, the smoke turned white. White smoke, the age-old symbol that a new pope had been chosen. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd, followed by cheers, cries, and songs of joy. People embraced one another, some falling to their knees in gratitude. The bells of St. Peter's Basilica began to ring, echoing far beyond the Vatican walls. Around the world, televisions and phones lit up with the news. The wait was over. Then came the long-awaited announcement. The Dean of Cardinals stepped onto the balcony. The crowd fell silent, hanging on his every word. Annuntio vobis gaudium, magnum, Habemus Papam. We have a pope, the crowd roared. Emotions flooded the square. And then, the name. Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle, a Filipino cardinal, deeply respected, known for his humility, compassion, and his ability to communicate with people across all walks of life. He had always been seen as a man of the people. Whether speaking in grand cathedrals or visiting humble homes, he carried with him a warmth that made people feel heard. Now, he was Pope Louis I, the first pope from the Philippines, the first from Asia, and a symbol of the Church's growing global diversity. As he stepped onto the balcony, wearing the simple white vestments of his new office, the crowd was captivated. He looked out over the sea of faces, eyes filled with awe and expectation. With a gentle smile, he raised his hand and offered his first blessing. The choice of the name Pope Louis XIII was no coincidence. It was a tribute to Saint Louis IX of France, a monarch known not for his wealth or power, but for his service to the poor and his dedication to justice. In choosing this, a name Pope Louis signaled his vision, one of service, humility, and compassion. This was not a leader who would rule from a throne, but a shepherd who would walk among his flock. The doors of St. Peter's Basilica opened fully, a symbolic gesture of a new beginning. As Pope Louis I stood in the golden light, the crowd below erupted again. Flags waved from every corner of the globe. Songs of praise filled the air. The sound of bells continued, joined by fireworks from across Rome. The atmosphere was electric, not just because of the event, but because of what it represented: a new chapter, a new hope. In the Philippines, celebration broke out instantly. Church bells rang across the archipelago. In Manila, crowds poured into the streets, waving flags, holding candles, praying, singing. In remote villages, people gathered around radios and television, screens, many wiping away tears of joy. This was more than just a national victory. It was a spiritual moment, a sign that someone from their land, their people, had been chosen to lead the universal church. Asia, as a whole, responded with joy and pride. From Korea to Vietnam, from Indonesia to India, the Catholic communities rejoiced. For decades, Asian Catholics had grown in number, in strength, in contribution to the global faith. Yet this was the first time their voice would truly echo from the heart of the Vatican. Pope Louis I was not just a symbol of faith. He was a bridge between East and West, a living connection between ancient tradition and modern reality. World leaders quickly sent their congratulations. Messages poured in from presidents, prime ministers, and monarchs, but the most heartfelt messages came from ordinary people. Social media lit up with photos, prayers, and artwork. Children in classrooms across the Philippines and beyond began drawing pictures of the new pope. His face, kind and fatherly, now appeared on banners, murals, and candles. His voice, soft yet strong, carried a message of peace that resonated with the world. Pope Louis I wasted no time in making his priorities clear. In his first few days, he visited a local shelter, spoke with the homeless, and washed the feet of refugees. The world was watching, and he knew it, but he didn't put on a show. These acts of compassion were not performances, they were habits. It was who he had always been. As a cardinal in Manila, he was often found comforting the sick, feeding the hungry, and advocating for justice. Now, as Pope, he would bring that same spirit to the global stage. He emphasized the need for a church that listens. He spoke out against exclusion and division. He reminded the faithful that the church is not a museum of saints, but a hospital for sinners. His words were simple, but powerful, and people listened. Even those who had drifted from the church began to tune in, drawn by his sincerity. He made clear that the church must go to the peripheries, to the places of pain, poverty, and neglect. His vision was not just spiritual, but practical. He called for care of the environment, an end to war and corruption, and a world where the dignity of every human being was protected. His speeches echoed with phrases like, "A church that breathes with both lungs, faith and action, and let the gospel be our map, not just our memory." Inside the Vatican, changes began. He brought in new advisors, many from non-European countries. He met personally with survivors of abuse and began pushing for stronger reforms. He opened dialogue with leaders of other religions, advocating for peace and cooperation. Interfaith gatherings became more common, and symbols of shared humanity were embraced. His prayer life was intense. Each morning he rose before sunrise and spent an hour in silence. His relationship with God was deep, personal, and genuine. And it showed. When he spoke, it wasn't just theology, it was heart, it was connection. And in a world often torn by noise and chaos, that quiet strength made a difference. He became known as the People's Pope. Not because he courted popularity, but because he made people feel seen. He smiled with his eyes. He listened without rushing. He traveled with minimal security, preferring to walk among crowds. He insisted on living in a modest Vatican residence rather than the papal palace. And he regularly invited guests, students, the elderly, workers, to share meals with him. He remembered names, asked about families, and followed up on concerns. In just a few months, he inspired millions. Churches saw renewed attendance. Confessions increased. Faith found new life in places where it had once felt dim. And perhaps most importantly, people who had given up hope found a reason to believe again. Not just in religion, but in kindness, in service, in the power of humility. His first major encyclical called on the world to embrace what he called active mercy. It wasn't enough to feel sorry for others, he wrote. True compassion required action, feeding the hungry, welcoming the stranger, protecting the earth, and standing with the oppressed. It was one of the most widely read documents in recent church history. It was simple, practical, and written in a way that even children could understand. The elderly called him a comfort, the youth called him a friend, bishops called him a reformer, and the poor, they called him one of their own. His papacy was a revolution, not of noise and protest, but of gentleness and persistence. Everywhere he went, he was greeted not as a ruler, but as a father. Pilgrims would often bring not gifts, but stories of hardship, of healing, of longing. And he listened. His eyes